All right, good morning, Excellencies, distinguished guests, and colleagues. Welcome to the International Peace Institute. My name is Jenna Russo. I'm the Director of Research here at IPI and also the head of the Brian Urquhart Center for Peace Operations. It's my pleasure to welcome you here today for this policy forum on preventing and responding to conflict-related sexual violence, examining the use of UN sanctions. As we're all aware, patterns of CRSV persist in conflicts across the globe. In acknowledgement of this, the UN Security Council has recognized CRSV as a threat to security and an impediment to the restoration of peace. And the UN has developed a variety of frameworks and tools to prevent and respond to CRSV. The purpose of our forum here today is to focus in on two of these tools, including the annex list of suspected perpetrators in the annual reports of the Secretary General on CRSV and UN sanctions regimes. This policy forum also launches a new IPI publication on UN tools for addressing conflict-related sexual violence and analysis of listings and sanctions processes, co-authored by myself and IPI policy analyst Lauren McGowan, and it is quite literally hot off the press this morning, and we're very happy to share it with you today. I'd like to thank our panel of speakers for being here today, and a very special thanks to Denmark for their generous support of today's event and the policy report being launched today. Thank you so much for being here. Today we'll hear from each of our speakers and then have time for question and answer with our in-person and virtual audiences. But first, I'm very pleased to welcome Ambassador Christina Marcus Lassen, Permanent Representative of Denmark to the United Nations, to provide opening remarks. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Morning, and thank you, Jenna, for this introduction, but also, of course, to you and to IPI for hosting us here today, but most of all, for the huge work they've done in this publication, getting it ready for today, and really on such an interesting topic. So I know you and Lauren have been extremely busy with this, and we're so happy that it worked out and we could do this meeting here today. Thank you also for everyone who joined us here today. I think it's been overwhelming, the interest for this policy forum, and really from everyone. I think both the member states, UN staff, and civil society, and I think it shows a little bit about how important this topic is and how much we actually want to know more about it and dive more into how we can make the system even better. Every year, we meet at the annual Security Council Open Debate on conflict-related sexual violence to discuss the patterns and trends on the basis of the Secretary General's report. This debate is fast approaching and will take place next Tuesday, as I'm sure everybody in this room will know. And I think when reading this year's report, it's obvious how the current level of conflict globally, which unfortunately has only intensified in the recent months, continues to expose civilians to increased levels of conflict-related sexual violence. This trend is, of course, fueled by arms proliferation and militarization among both state and non-state armed actors. Sexual violence continues to play a significant role in the political economy of war, enabling armed groups and transnational criminal networks to stay afloat and generate revenue. I think a sentence that is often repeated, including by us, is that we have a strong normative framework in place for our response to CRSV, but the compliance with international norms regarding conflict-related sexual violence of these armed groups and parties to conflict in general, unfortunately, remains very low. Despite the clear prohibition of international law, CRSV remains a brutal reality which leaves behind a deep sense of guilt, stigma, and not least fear for those affected. And given that only very few victims come forward for help, care, or justice, we still do not know the full extent of this crime worldwide. Let me just, at this point, take a moment to express our appreciation for the Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence and Conflict, also represented here today. The office is a very trusted and valued partner by Denmark and a crucial coordinator of the interagency network called United Nations Actions Against Sexual Violence and Conflict. The office is, as you know, behind the extensive information gathered for the annual reports of the Secretary General, which also includes an annex of detailed information on parties to armed conflict that are credibly suspected of committing or being responsible for acts of rape or other forms of sexual violence. This report, sadly, has over the year been a daunting historical record for the prevalence of CRSV. In fact, more than 70% of the parties listed in the Secretary General's latest report are persistent perpetrators, which means that they have appeared in the annex for more than 5 years, for 5 or more years, without taking remedial or corrective action. In response to this, we've heard the Secretary General consistently calling for enhanced coherence between the list annexed in his annual report and the designation of parties for UN sanctions measures to strengthen compliance and prevention. The SG has also called for formal arrangement that will allow for the Security Council to consistently monitor compliance by parties to conflict and the measures that they are taking to prevent CRSV. And that's actually one of the reasons that we chose to partner with the International Peace Institute, so IPI, to dive deeper into the toolbox that we have at our disposal and support this call, both as member states and as UN system. This has resulted in the publication that we just heard about that's being launched here today, really fresh out of the press. I think I can testament to that. And that's an examination of the UN tools for addressing CRSV, including an analysis of the listing and sanction processes. It was a huge study. I know it was super difficult to do, but we are really pleased to support the study and the independent research, of course, as IPI as a whole. So really congratulations with this report, which is extremely timely just before the debate next week. A last point from my side, a little bit of PR, not in terms of permanent representative, but public relations for Denmark. Just 3 weeks ago in this exact venue, it looks totally different that day. I don't know why you did something, you closed the windows or something. But just 3 weeks ago, we had our foreign minister, Lars Løkke Rasmussen, here in this room launching Denmark's priorities for our candidature and hopeful seat on the Security Council for 2025-2026. Needless to say, when we worked on our priorities, it was really a no-brainer for us that women, peace and security should be at the heart of our efforts in the Council if we are elected on June 6th. So with those words, let me just give my strong commitment to everyone here today that we will continue the fight against conflict-related sexual violence if we succeed to being elected to a seat on the Council, which obviously we hope, and we hope for everyone's support. So we look very much forward for this discussion here today. Kicking off now with this panel discussion with people who are real experts on this, and with the rest of us, or at least me, listening very interested at the same time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Thank you for those comments. And thanks again to Denmark, not only for supporting this project, but for your long-term support on WPS and these important issues. So to kick off our conversation, my colleague Lauren and I will briefly present some of the findings of our report, and then we will turn to each of the panelists to further expand on some of the key points from the research. So let me first introduce our speakers here today. To my far right, Lauren McGowan is a policy analyst for IPI. Prior to joining IPI, Lauren was the Conflict Prevention and Sustaining Peace Global Fellow at UN University, and she's also spent time working for Amnesty International and with the UN Office for the High Commissioner on Human Rights. I will not be reading all the full bios for all of our panelists because that would take up most of our time here today, so I'll give an abridged version. Next to my right, we have Tandrai Chikua, Senior Policy Advisor in the UN Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict. Tandrai previously worked on child protection issues in several UN peacekeeping operations and conducted negotiations with armed forces and groups for the release of child soldiers and prevention measures against the use of sexual violence as a tactic of war. Joining us online today, we have Natasha Hraikau, Associate Fellow, Global Fellowship Initiative of the Geneva Center for Security Policy, and the former coordinator for the UN Panel of Experts on Somalia. Natasha was also a special advisor to the chairman Lomé Peace and Security Forum and a regional conflict advisor for the World Health Organization with a focus on Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. Next, we have Francesca Casar to my far left, the Africa Economic and Development Coordinator for the Permanent Mission of Malta to the UN. Francesca has served with Malta's Foreign Service since 2015 and was previously the rapporteur of the Second Committee during the 77th session of the General Assembly, and a special thanks to her for being with us during what is a very busy time for Malta on the Council. And then finally, I'm pleased to welcome Pauline Broche, Policy Specialist, Protection and Transitional Justice for UN Women. Pauline leads UN Women's global work on protection, including CRSV, and she previously served on UN Women's team working on the Security Council. Pauline also spends time with the UN Peacekeeping Mission in the Central African Republic and is a fellow in the office of the SRSG on sexual violence and conflict. So a very warm thank you to all of our panelists. And as you can see, we have a very wonderful panel that is well positioned to help us walk through some of these issues. So first, Lauren, I'll turn over to you to present some of the findings from the report.
Thank you, Jenna, and thank you again to the Permanent Mission of Denmark for your generous support for this project. I'd like to begin just by providing a quick overview of the report, and then I'll walk through a couple key findings. So as Jenna and the ambassador both noted, our research looks at two tools. The first is the annual report of the Secretary General on CRSV, which includes an annex list of perpetrators who are credibly suspected of committing or being responsible for patterns of CRSV violations within context on the agenda of the Security Council based on UN verified information. These parties can include both state as well as non-state actors. The second tool, of course, is UN sanctions. So some sanctions regimes have designation criterion that allows for perpetrators of SGBV to be sanctioned for committing these violations. And over the past 2 decades, the UN Security Council and the Secretariat have attempted to increase the links between the CRSV agenda and sanctions. This also includes persistent and consistent recommendations by the Secretary General to also increase the links between these annual reports and the use of sanctions. And so to that end, our report really focused on, one, understanding the level of coherence between the parties listed in the annex of the Secretary General's report, and in turn, who are designated for sanctions. And second, looking a bit more broadly at analyzing how sanctions have actually been used in response to CRSV. And before I share a few of the key findings, just one quick terminology note, and that's that the Secretary General's reports utilize the term and scope CRSV, whereas sanctions designations utilize SGBV. So that's why you'll hear me going back and forth between the two, just to note that SGBV can encompass CRSV, but it's a bit broader in scope. I will also be referencing primarily quantitative data from the report, so have a few PowerPoint slides just to help visualize the findings. And I see we already have our first key finding up. Thanks, Chelsea. So our first key finding is that there's limited overlap between the parties listed in the annex of the Secretary General's annual reports and in sanctions regimes. So to make this determination, we looked at overlap in 2 respects. The first is just whether parties who are listed in the annex also are sanctioned. And then the second is whether the party is specifically designated for committing SGBV as opposed to some other sort of violation under the regime. So think like an arms embargo, for example. So we based our analysis on the Secretary General's reports, which was released last summer, that covers the 2022 reporting period. Now, in their report, there are 49 parties who are listed in the annex, both state as well as non-state, listed again because they committed or were responsible for patterns of CRSV violations. And Chelsea, we can go to the next slide, please. So this chart, which is also in the 2-pager provided to you on your seats, shows the breakdown of those 49 parties by the number of years that they appear in the annex of the Secretary General and whether or not they have been sanctioned. So as shown in green, we found that 21 parties in the annex are currently designated for sanctions. Now that's either because the group itself is sanctioned or because individuals who are part of that group are sanctioned. Now, we found that there are an additional 7 parties in the annex, this is indicated in blue, who are not eligible for sanctions because there's currently no regime in place for their context. And finally, and I think this is the key number, there are 21 parties who are eligible for sanctions but have not been designated. These are indicated in orange. So of these 21 parties, you can see that the majority have actually been in the annex for quite some time, and in fact 14 are persistent perpetrators, meaning that they've been listed for 5 years or more without taking remedial action. Some actually, as you can see by the bar on the far right, have actually been listed for more than 10 years. So in summary, while we do see that there are actually some parties in the annex who are in turn sanctioned, this is not actually the case across the board. And then secondly, we then examined why, right? So why were parties actually sanctioned? And this meant looking at the designation criterion and seeing were they sanctioned again because they were committing SGBV violations, or were they sanctioned for some other kind of violation within the regime, again, such as violating an arms embargo, being involved in the illicit trade, exploitation of natural resources, et cetera. And what we found is that actually the majority of parties who were in the annex and also sanctioned were not sanctioned because they had committed sexual violence, but instead were sanctioned for some other reason. Which brings me to the second key finding, and Chelsea, we can go to the next slide again, please. And that's that designations for violations of SGBV are relatively rare. So to make this determination, we looked at the 14 different UN sanctions regimes which are currently in place, and at the 752 individuals and entities who are currently designated to see why they were sanctioned. And Chelsea, we can go to the next and final slide, please. And we found that of the 614 individuals and 138 entities who are currently sanctioned, only 25 individuals and 2 entities had been sanctioned for committing SGBV. So, despite the fact that sexual violence is known to be widespread across many of the contexts where there's sanctions regimes in place, designations based on committing SGBV actually account for less than 4% of all the 752 that are currently sanctioned by the UN. So in the report, obviously, we get into many more key findings. We also discuss why this is the case, both one, why there's limited overlap between the parties in the annex and sanctions, and 2, why designations for SGBV are so rare. But I'm going to stop here and turn it back to Jenna, who can walk us through some of those rationale.
Thank you so much. So in looking at why these numbers are the case, we specifically consider constraints on the panels of experts whose job it is to provide statements of case to the committees on potential sanctions designations, as well as some of the political barriers within sanctions committees. So first, on the panels of experts, when building statements of case on suspected perpetrators, the experts put together detailed portfolios of evidence in which each documented violation is corroborated by a minimum of 3 witnesses or sources, and each of these are carefully vetted before they're included in the case. Gathering this level of evidence can be quite difficult given security constraints, intentional blockages by state and non-state actors, and difficulty in accessing remote areas. And even in cases where witnesses can be accessed, they may be reluctant to participate due to shame or lack of trust. Experts also work with very few resources, not only in terms of very modest salaries under difficult working conditions, but also with no additional resources. For example, if a witness needs access to transportation or lodging, if they need translation or other services to facilitate interviews. This was cited as a major impediment to the work of the experts. They also work with constrained capacity. Humanitarian and human rights-related crimes are usually covered by a single expert within the committee. Imagine covering a country like the DRC and having just one expert to investigate and report on all SGBV and humanitarian violations for the entire country. There's a massive number of armed groups, huge geography, and just the sheer volume of investigating and reporting on IHL-related violations makes this very difficult. Yet arguably, the greater barrier to designations for SGBV is a political barrier. Because sanctions committees operate on the basis of consensus, the extent to which designations are adopted depends very much on the political and working relationship of the committee members. Thus, in some contexts like Haiti or the DRC, there has been a stronger consensus on the use of sanctions, while other contexts have been much more difficult. For example, Sudan, where only 3 individuals are currently designated in total, and there have been no new designations since 2014, despite historically high levels of violence in Darfur and across the country. The lack of designations for SGBV is particularly pronounced when speaking about terrorist organizations. And this is interesting because conceivably terrorist organizations have few, if any, sympathizers within the council, and yet there is a noticeable lack of designations for SGBV. In particular, the 1267 regime, which covers ISIS, al-Qaeda, and associated groups, contains no designation criteria for humanitarian or human rights violations, including SGBV, despite some of the worst atrocities on record. Even in counterterrorism environments where SGBV criterion does exist, it has been underutilized. For example, SGBV was added to the regime for al-Shabaab in 2018, yet no individuals are currently sanctioned under this criterion, despite the fact that al-Shabaab has been a persistent perpetrator within the annual reports of the Secretary General listed for the past 9 years. Finally, I want to emphasize that while all sanctions can be politically contentious, sanctions are still a widely used tool by the UN and by member states. As Lauren mentioned, there are more than 750 parties and individuals currently sanctioned by the UN. So in other words, member states can use sanctions when they want to, but the fact that only 27 of these more than 750 are sanctioned for SGBV indicates that SGBV is not elevated to the same extent that other crimes are. So I will stop here. Of course, we encourage you to check out the entire report once the event is over, and I'm very happy now to turn to our panel so that we can begin to hear from each of them. So first, I would like to turn to my right, to Tandrai. Tandrai, I would love it if you could spend a few minutes talking about how the use of sanctions and the listing process fits into the broader scope of your work in the Office of the SRSG and addressing CRSV, and why you think enhancing the complementarity between these two tools can be an effective measure to prevent and respond to CRSV. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jenna, and let me also begin by echoing our office's appreciation for the heavy lifting and thought that IPI has put into this area of work, which is a high priority for the Office of the Special Representative. And of course, nothing moves and nothing is possible without the commitment of resources to do this work. So our gratitude to Denmark for the sustained support for this and also the support to the Office of the Special Representative. So maybe I could begin with a kind of view of the village from the hilltop. And I was reflecting on the fact that the report, when you read it, expresses some frustration about gaps that exist. But I think it's important to say a word about the road traveled so far. And when you consider the fact that when the mandate of the Special Representative was established in 2009, at that time, there was a complete blind spot in the sanctions regimes on human rights issues at all. There was no single sanctions regime with designation criteria or even mention in the mandate constructs on conflict-related sexual violence or grave violations against children. And in what is, by Council standards, quite a short period of time, we now are not talking about regimes that are missing these designation criteria. We're deeper in the mechanics of that conversation of how we can improve the effectiveness of how they work. But I would call it not only progress, but a paradigm shift that all of the sanctions regimes are no longer blind to the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war and grave violations against children. These are considered sanctionable violations. We can't underestimate how important and how much of a paradigm shift this is. In terms of the broader picture and how this fits into the overall strategy on CRSV, I think that we have to own the reality, with all the progress that has been made, that the situation on the ground is still catastrophic. The next report of the Secretary General is making its way from the printing press into your hands now. The open debate for that report will be next Tuesday, as was mentioned. And it's a catastrophic report. So the reality is that it's still cost-free, for the most part, to rape women, children, men in conflict situations. And until we change that dynamic and make it costly, make it consequential for parties to commit these violations, we'll never stem the tide. So as we have thought about a framework and a strategy for preventing these crimes, we have looked really about how to add cost and consequence. And so there's been a great focus on tackling impunity, on justice and accountability, on prosecuting these crimes through national courts and the support we give to countries to strengthen rule of law, to attack sexual violence. But part of that thinking around cost and consequences is also about leveraging the tools, other tools, including the tools of the Security Council, and the signal that is sent when perpetrators of sexual violence are sanctioned by the Council. Some of them care, and the good news is that we have been able to leverage the credible threat of sanctions to gain tangible protection outcomes. Some don't care, and other approaches are needed. But for us, the use of sanctions has never been an exercise in complete coverage. It's about, because in any case, the sanctions regimes don't cover all of the situations that are of concern on the Secretary General's agenda. Jenna spoke a little bit about the blue actors who are not eligible because of the mechanics and there being no sanctions regimes. But for us, it's always been about picking it first, some low-hanging fruit, and sending a clear and consistent signal that if you commit these crimes, if you command, condone, or commit conflict-related sexual violence, the world can fall around your head too. This is a sanctionable offense. And so we can't overestimate how important it is, each victory and each sanctioning on the committees, and hence our focus on enhancing that. I would say that it's a question about sanctions enhancing the effectiveness of listing and the other way around, the listing enhancing the effectiveness of sanctions. These are mutually reinforcing processes for us. The listing has always been seen as an entry point for engaging parties. If it's about a list in the Secretary General's report that nobody reads, there are no real tangible protection outcomes. There's no intrinsic value to that. So it was always been understood that if we can leverage the listing, the spotlight on the perpetrators, to put them under pressure to engage, then we have the possibility of tangible, of flesh, blood, and bone, literally, protection outcomes as a result of that. And the good news is that we have, over the years, been able to leverage the list of the Secretary General and the sanction signals, including some designations or threats of designations. We have been able to leverage that for real protection outcomes. So I would say that it is a vast and largely uncharted territory or underutilized territory. And for us, the big picture is that through the use of these tools, there is a possibility to increase, to expand the protection horizon, and to gain tangible protection outcomes from these processes.
Thank you so much for that, Tandra, and I appreciate you noting how much has been gained in the last 15 years, because I think sometimes it's easy in this community to feel overwhelmed by the realities and all the blockages and feel like, well, what's the point? What can we actually achieve? But when you look back at it, in fact, member states have been able to achieve a lot. And so that should be incentive for all of us to continue pressing forward on this. Natasha, I'd like to turn next to you, to our online panelists today. Natasha, you have experience working with panels of experts, and I'm hoping you can speak a little bit to some of the challenges that panels of experts face when gathering information and reporting on CRSV, and maybe some of the recommendations that you think could strengthen the work of the panelists in this regard. Natasha, over to you.
Thank you, Jenna. And look, I really would like to add my voice in thanks to Denmark and IPI, and huge congratulations to Lauren and Jenna for the work that they've done. I think for so many, the work of sanctions regimes is pretty opaque and somewhat convoluted, and that you've been able to bring these tools together in such a clear way is a real asset for all of us. So thank you and congratulations again. I want to make a couple of comments very quickly about the need for sanctions to be alive. They need to be active mechanisms to be able to provide the sort of support and platform that the CSRV needs and deserves. As a practitioner, I am always very focused on what are we able to do for communities, for states at that more operational level. And it is clear that minimizing CRSV, removing these assumptions of impunity, talking again about leverage, but leveraging people to peace processes down the track, documenting, putting in groundwork for transitional justice processes. That is the work that sanctions should be supporting in the much broader sense. And the more that we can do that and we can ensure coherence across the multiple United Nations tools, I think the better we're going to be. I had looked at the report and the limited number of what are generally SGBV sanctions listings, and I'm in absolute accord that, hey, it's not where it needs to be, but it is something of an evolving tool, and we have to acknowledge and cheer on those evolutions. But I think we also need, in the same breath, to be looking at, well, what other designations are going through? And the designations are quite low. The challenges in getting those designations through are hard over all of the topics, and that's something that we have a lot of potential to improve. But equally, we need to look at delisting. For those designations to have the maximum impact, there needs to be a prospect of being delisted as well. I noticed in the report that you highlighted some of the challenges to even have a well-documented dead name removed from a list. If that can take months and really hundreds of human hours to do, that's something we need to be working on to make sure that really this is opening doorways, it is opening discussions and processes to change behaviours. So that's a part that we need to really focus on. And again, that kind of pushes me into this integrating all of the tools that we have at our disposal. And sometimes I think the sanctions and their panels, we have an independence that is absolutely core, but that independence can also be interpreted a little bit too much as an individual scope of action and can lead to isolation. And so that is something else that is generally going to need a rethink to be able to be the tool that is there to serve. So I guess that implies that some of my comments are quite broad. But for me, the CRSV example is so key to our peace and security work. It's so key to communities being able to manage their way through conflicts now at the other end, that it's an excellent example of how these things can be done. So really quickly, I guess the areas that I would ask people to consider are raising the level of ambition beyond delivering interesting reports. We really need to put more effort into strengthening relationship and trust building. Again, if these reports are going to lead to something, that needs to be invested in. Strategic intent. If you look at most sanctions lists, they're a pretty random list of names. They don't particularly capture what are the challenges of those communities, and they should say that, which is why they should include more names on the SGBV portfolio. Sanctions are inherently political at every level, from the community to the Security Council, and we need a very politically literate panels of experts. That doesn't mean that they're political actors, but their reports need to land in politically sensitive areas, and they need to land with as much impact as is possible. Going to your points, Jenna, a little bit of specifics. It was interesting listening to the 1267 example in particular. And I guess it's something that all of us sanctions folk are very familiar with. But 1267 relies on member state reporting. They don't do investigations. So the only way they are going to even be in a position to raise these issues is by relying on member states and what member states give them. The panels of experts in some of the other regimes can carry out their own work, but 1267 can't. And I think that's maybe an oversight that's led to some of this lack of designation. And I'm going to make a couple of comments on challenges to panels, and this is in no way critical of the work that's been done in New York, although it does point a little bit to some of the challenges there. For panels to move, there is a pretty heavy bureaucratic process run from New York that's quite risk averse. And that's, again, absolutely normal for a UN organization. But it means that there can be enormous time delays and populations that are displacing multiple times. Those populations are hard to track. And so there isn't a responsiveness in the system. Panels tend, in the main part, to be dispersed globally. Again, making that slow. You already referred to having the right people and the right number of people in terms of investigators. That also needs to be in terms of support systems to enable those investigators to move. A couple of really quick, because I know you don't have time for everything. But I think we need to reimagine sanctions beyond that classic coerce, constrain, and signal measurements. For more than a decade, we've talked about sanctions not being purely punitive. Okay, so what does that mean? How are we partnering to create something? I talk about build. How do we take our investigations, as I say, from these interesting observations to having a real so what and suggestions for next actions? It's not for panels to be operational and to do that, but it's for panels to interact very closely with the operational UN entities to have impact. And one of the biggest pieces for that is, at the moment, the leadership within panels is an absolute flat structure. Yes, the coordinator does have a coordination role, but that's an internal, mostly bureaucratic role in terms of the wording of the TORs. If you want an external coordination, which will enable multiple statements of case to actually lead to designations instead of just being delivered, you need an external coordination role. And that will fundamentally change how panels' work is in terms of relationships, in terms of political landing, in terms of the impact that what is actually amazing investigation being done in all sorts of really difficult environments across the world. So I would push those things. I would like to keep talking, but thank you again so much for including me.
Thank you so much, Natasha, and for providing those very specific recommendations. And I'm sure we will have time to turn back to you again during the Q&A. And I really like the idea, the language about sanctions being alive and what does it mean for them to be more responsive in terms of trying to change behavior. Next, I'm very happy to turn to Francesca. Francesca, especially given Malta's role in regards to the 1267 regime, it would be great to hear you talk a bit about that and the importance of adding SGBV as a criterion within that regime. And then also what role for the E10 and thinking about how they can help to shape the work of the Council when it comes to sanctions and SGBV. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Jenna. Good morning, colleagues. And of course, firstly, I would like also to join colleagues in thanking the IPI and Denmark for convening us today on this very important debate, also as currently presidency of the Security Council, SGBV, and all the accompanying facets of it are synonymous to Malta's foreign policy and priorities on the Council. So you can count on our support on that. So I think, for starters, the Council has in itself responded and answered to the question of SGBV and potentially having a designation criteria in each of the respective regimes. And this answer took place really and truly 16 years ago when in 2008 the Council adopted Resolution 1820. So sort of that frames us here in our discussion. And in so doing, of course, this intention to sanction perpetrators should then guide us along the way. And as Natasha said, indeed, sanctions regimes should be used to reflect evolving context and thereby being a living tool. So moving straight to your query on 1267, indeed, we've mentioned how half of the sanctions regime right now have a standalone designation criteria on SGBV, or as more broadly on IHL, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law. But in the case of terrorism, where more often than not, terrorism is accompanied with continuous and multiple documented cases of sexual and gender-based violence, including, all the different facets of it. And yet there's a noticeable lack here because there's actually no designation criteria yet. At the moment, the 1267 regime, which covers ISIL, Al-Qaeda, and associated individuals and groups, purely focuses on designation, criteria relating to financing, supplying arms, and recruitment, which is why there are no parties associated with SGBV sanctioned in this case. In Resolution 2242, adopted in 2015, the Council had expressed its intention to consider targeted sanctions for individuals and entities involved in trafficking and sexual violence and for their involvement in SGBV linked to terrorism. So with that in mind, also at the moment we're working with partners on the Council to try and get a designation criteria eventually in future renewals of this regime. So we're hoping that that could also, work out, considering, as I said, the multiple documented cases of SGBV linked to terrorism. And of course, by adding this designation criteria, also joining colleagues here, we can help advance accountability on SGBV linked to terrorism, which is, as I said, a tactic used predominantly against civilians in both conflict and non-conflict settings. And of course, then that leads me also to the importance of having this designation on the operational side of things. We rely very much on panels of experts, and we're grateful to have a former coordinator with us here present in our discussion, because this will eventually guide the composition and the working method of the panel and the Sanctions Committee, which we ourselves, as committee members being part of the Security Council, will have to engage with. This will, of course, include the kind of expertise that the panel of experts need, the resources needed to conduct their work, but also the constituencies that they themselves can engage with on the ground when they are conducting their investigations. So that's really, I think, very important to know why this is important, because it also enables the Council to work better by having this operation in full motion. And I would also like to take the occasion, given that this event is taking place ahead of the Council debate on CRCV, which is taking place next week, we are actually having a focus, quite a niched focus, on disarmament and demilitarization linked to SGBV. Here we often see how targeted arms embargoes within the realm of sanctions regime apply to both state actors and non-state actors, which are listed as known perpetrators to SGBV, can also reduce the risk, because more often than not, SGBV is linked to weapons and arms flows. So therefore, by reducing the overall availability of weapons, we are also limiting the conditions that perpetuate CRCV to take place in the first place. So yeah, that's really more or less what we are envisaging, and we look forward to our discussions in moving forward next week. And yes, a very important question that you asked, Jenna: what role can elected members of the Security Council, advance in shaping the Council's approaches and responses to CRCV? As elected 10, we coordinate in multiple ways. Most of us are also members of what we call now the Shared Commitment Holders on Women, Peace and Security, which encapsulates 11 members of the Council. And this is a formation that Malta presently coordinates. Experts of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, we call them WPS experts. They often coordinate with us, political lead experts on the file, but also our sanctions, people in the permanent missions, and we try to coordinate positions as holistically as possible, considering the multitude of layers that are involved in many political cases. For example, in Sudan, you have a very, very obvious political scenario which needs to take into account the rampant cases of SGBV that are taking place in the current context of hostilities in Darfur. Also, many sanctions committees, actually all of them are led by an elected 10 member, so chaired by an elected 10 delegation. So this enables, of course, within the guidelines of the sanctions committees, we could also engage further with stakeholders that are relevant to our discussion within the sanctions committees to continually share ideas in that framework. And also important are visits by the sanctions committees. I was honored enough and privileged to join 2 of the chair's visits last year to Central African Republic and South Sudan. And in both of these visits, we were able to engage thoroughly with both the stakeholders, the relevant authorities, but also more broadly with people on the ground. So yeah, as I said, being an elected member, I think, on the council also enables us to come with a common principled view on SGBV, but also an apolitical, impartial outlook, which is most needed when we are looking at potential designation criteria in this regard. And I think that really sums up our approach to sanctions, that this is a holistic tool. It should be accompanied, of course, with broader tools of peace building, peacemaking. It could also be an entry point with stakeholders and also with governments and regional players to enable them to have the right tools to not only mitigate but address a survivor-centered approach to SGBV. So I think that's really what I wanted to add today, and over back to you, Jenna. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And in fact, that's a perfect segue now to turning to Pauline. You know, the focus of this report, as we've been saying, is on the SG's reports and on sanctions, but that's only one piece of a broader puzzle. And of course, those in themselves are not sufficient to having a more holistic approach to preventing and responding to CRSV. So Pauline, turning to you, maybe if you can touch a little bit on the benefits, but also the challenges of using sanctions to respond to CRSV and how they fit into this broader survivor-centered approach that we're talking about. Over to you.
Thank you, Jenna. And I also first join the other panelists for thanking IPI and Denmark for organizing this very important event and for inviting UN Women to participate in this discussion. Before responding to your questions, I'd also like to congratulate you, Jenna and Lauren, to this excellent report, which, is a very helpful guidance and resource for the future for practitioners working on sanctions and CRSV, and fills a gap. So thank you very much for this. Let me start with the first question about benefits and challenges to using sanctions as a tool to address CRSV. I'd like to focus on 2 benefits and 2 challenges. The first benefit is I would like to highlight the signaling effect that sanctions can have. Listings under an explicit SGBV criterion make CRSV visible and draw attention to the commission of these crimes, which is important because often CRSV is an invisible crime and violation. An explicit listing demonstrates to the perpetrator and to potential future perpetrators that the Security Council takes CRSV serious and is committed to take action to respond to it. And it also signals to survivors that there is at least some sort of response to the violations. And this is particularly important in situations where we see high levels of impunity for CRSV, even though I would like to caution here too that sanctions can never be a replacement for a justice process. Another benefit I'd like to mention here that is maybe a bit less obvious, but also important, is the importance of the documentation and reporting done by the panels of experts. The reports of many of the panels actually include a lot of good information and analysis on CRSV, which is useful for not only for the sanctions committees, but also for the work of the Security Council more broadly. So, for example, the Secretariat of the Informal Expert Group on Women, Peace and Security, where UN Women hosts the Secretariat, regularly includes analysis from the sanctions, from the panel of expert reports in the background notes for the IEG meetings, which then also inform the recommendations by the IEG. And these, the analysis and information provided by the panels of experts become particularly important in contexts where there is no UN mission with a human rights monitoring mandate or no UN human rights investigation mandated by the Human Rights Council. Now turning to the challenges. I think we've heard from almost all panelists the challenge of the inconsistent and rare use of sanctions to address CRSV. And we've heard also from Lauren that there are actually 752 listings or sanctions listings, but only 27 related to CRSV. So the Security Council is using sanctions, but it's not really using them consistently to address CRSV. And Jenna, you've outlined some of the challenges you see, and I think the report really does a great job to highlight the constraints for the panel of experts, but also the issue of the lack of political will. I'd like to add here another challenge that I see is that there is room for improvement to strengthen the exchanges between the sanctions community and the WPS community at the technical level, which might help then also to prioritize CRSV listings. So ideas to strengthen this could be to hold dedicated meetings of the sanctions committees focused on CRSV and women's rights violations. And also, and that's, it's a pretty low-hanging fruit, but to invite sanctions experts to join the meetings of the Informal Expert Group on Women, Peace and Security, and vice versa, having the WPS experts participating in meetings of the sanctions committees. A second challenge that I see is there's a disconnect between the whole sanctions community and civil society. Civil society it's not very present in all these these discussions, and I think there are reasons for that. From the outside, the process, sanctions process seems very opaque and transparent and closed, which makes it difficult for civil society to engage and to advocate and to engage in these processes. So I think it would be helpful for the sanctions committees to see how there can be further engagement and outreach to kind of bridge this disconnect. And the report includes a recommendation to really ensure that when the sanctions committees conduct field visits, to also hold consultations with women civil society organizations, which I think is an important step to address this kind of disconnect. Because it is important that sanctions committees listen to the recommendations and reflections from civil society and to take these into account in their discussions and in their decisions. And now turning to the second part of the question, the survivor-centered approach, which is indeed another challenge when we look at sanctions and the use of sanctions in the context of CRSV. So I'm thankful that you asked me that question. So there are a couple of aspects which make it difficult in the sanctions context to adopt a survivor-centered approach, how it is set up at the moment. So the report details, and has also been come up in the discussion, the lack of necessary resources for members of the panels of experts, for example, to pay for the transport of survivors to a safe place to be interviewed, or to pay for translation services. So this lack of resources creates risks for the physical safety of survivors, and which really runs against the do no harm principle and is not in line with the survivor-centered approach. Another aspect, and that has also come up, is that there is no dedicated SGBV or gender expert in the panels, which can pose challenges with regards to the gender sensitivity of the investigations and the emotional and psychological safety of survivors. And also in that respect, it is important that that members of the panels of experts, are given the adequate resources to ensure safe investigations, and also to provide trainings so that they have the necessary expertise on SGBV and gender. Another issue, a final issue I would like to mention with regards to the survivor-centered approach is that the whole listing and sanctions process is not very participatory, where there are very few entry points for the meaningful participation of survivors. So in that respect, it is important to use the few entry points that are there. That is, for example, to continue or even strengthen inviting survivors to the Security Council and to brief in meetings of the Security Council. And but in this context, again, I would also highlight that the sanctions cannot replace any kind of justice process where there are actually much more guarantees and entry points for the meaningful participation of survivors. And it is important for the Security Council to continue pushing for the establishment of ordinary justice processes, of transitional justice processes, which have much more room for the participation of survivors. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much, Pauline. And just to emphasize what some folks have said, there are some areas of low-hanging fruit here. Some of the aspects of the very political nature of sanctions we will not be able to solve in the short term. But when it comes to simple things like ensuring that panels of experts have individuals who have been trained to conduct investigations on sexual violence, that's something that can be achieved. Ensuring that they have basic resources to cover translation, that's something that can be achieved. So we can at least aim for some of these aspects that would help to improve these processes today, while we also work for those longer term changes that we're aiming for. So now we would like to open the floor for a time of Q&A. We have some microphones in the room, so if you'd like to ask a question to any of the panelists, please raise your hand. And for our online audience, you are also able to ask a question by using the Q&A box, and I will keep my eye on both spaces at once. So anyone would like to go first and ask a question? Yes, please. And when you ask your question, if you don't mind introducing yourself. Thank you.
Sure. My name is Safa Chadovich with Justice for All. We're a Muslim-based human rights organization here at the UN. We had our start in Bosnia during the war in my ancestral Bosnia in the 1990s. My question is this, and once again, thank you wonderful for the IPI for organizing this very important effect. I have relatives who were victims of the rape camp and have survived. One of them was in Bosnia. One of them also was pregnant as a result of the rape camps. 20,000 to 50,000 of our women were raped. I worked with the Bosnian mission to the United Nations for quite a few years during the wartime period. As of today, and this goes to justice mechanisms in place, as of today, less than 1% of those who have been raped during the Bosnian War, when the ICTY, and we were successful with working with a lot of allies in getting rape listed as a war crime, not simply as a byproduct, as unfortunately is still being taught at our National Defense University and military universities across the world. So that's something maybe you want to think about, introducing a new course that is training officers that rape is not a byproduct, rape is a war crime. And I'm sorry I'm being a little bit emotional. This touches me very personally. To my knowledge, 27 cases went through the ICTY, okay, with the International War Crimes Tribunal. There was 120 some odd cases that were tried through Bosnian court system. There's another 200 that are on the docket currently. That doesn't come anywhere near to address the crimes that have taken place, nor not just the issues of translation and support, ongoing support. The women continuously have to deal with the nightmare of what happened to them, and as well as the results, and there's no support mechanism, especially in a country that is right now basically dysfunctional like my Bosnia and Herzegovina. So my question is, support systems for those who have been victims of the rape, not just relying on the NGO, CSO, civil society organizations, but the larger communities. Is that possible? Secondly, there was an International War Crimes Tribunal. Rape did become a war crime during that time. Is it a possibility, since the Security Council is always subject to political game playing and geosphere politics, or whatever you want to call it these days, is there a possibility of having an International War Crimes Tribunal in general, because rape is not something limited to a particular country or a particular location, or in armed conflicts, that would have the resources necessary and would be outside of that political game playing that's taking place? And then the third part of that is, to what extent can the ICC be utilized in this process of doing multi-nation rape investigations with regard to our sisters and our mothers and our daughters who have been raped? We also work on the issue of the Rohingyas. 500,000 of them of our sisters have been raped or witnessed raped during that situation. And Myanmar is not in someone's favorite country around the world these days, at least the military junta is not. And so I just wanted to raise that issue as well. And of course, what's happening in the Holy Land is something that needs to be addressed as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. We'll take a couple of questions and then we'll turn back to the panel.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. Very excited to read the report. My name is Maya Ungar. I am with the International Crisis Group. I have a specific question for Tandra. I was really interested with your comments. You mentioned a couple times about leveraging credible threat of sanctions to gain tangible outcomes. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on how the office does that, and really, signaling of sanctions regimes is something that has been brought up quite a bit throughout the presentations. So it'd be really helpful to hear tangibly how the office or how any of the different presenters use that threat.
Yes, right behind you, Adikin, I see another hand behind you.
I'm Brigadier Sumal. Thank you very much for the most thought-provoking discussion. My question is, now as you said, the tools and the sanction, if they are to be effective, the security of the victims and the civilians need to be ensured. Otherwise, no one will come to give evidence or give statement for this thing. So what is the mechanism, a realistic mechanism, which is to be practiced to ensure the security of these victims? Thank you.
Thank you. I think we can take one more in this round and then we'll turn back.
Thank you, Gareth Sweeney, Crisis Action. If I may, two quick questions. One is, are we operating in an environment now where the more effective panel of experts reports are, the more likely that their mandates are to be discontinued in terms of the environment on the Security Council? And the second question is, do you have, to our colleague from UN Women's question about utilizing panel of experts reports more widely than just the Sanctions Committee, do you have precedents where panels of experts have addressed violations of arms embargoes by states, not by individuals or entities, but by states? And then what, beyond the sanctions committees, should or have the Security Council done historically to address incidents where allegations or conclusions by panel of experts that states have violated arms embargoes? How has or should the Security Council or Security Council members be addressing those?
Thank you. So we'll turn back to our panel and then we may have time for a few more questions after that. Tandra, maybe I can start with you if that's okay.
Sure. No, thank you so much for all the questions. Maybe I can begin with the question related to protection outcomes. I think one example which was quite dramatic for us was in the context of South Sudan. We had a long-standing dialogue with both the government and the then SPLA in opposition. We met with Dr. Riek Machar, the head of the opposition, SPLA-IO, on several occasions. He made the right political noises, concerns, but it was clear that he was taking these meetings because he saw it as a good optic. But we never really got a sense of the tires hitting the tarmac and real traction in terms of a conversation on putting in place protection measures. He sat up and listened, began really listening, when in one of these meetings we were able to inform him that the next resolution, sanctions resolution on South Sudan, will carry specific or standalone designation criteria on sexual violence. And that, as he is aware, the council goes for the top of the food chain. So it may be rogue commanders, as he was saying in our discussions, that and a lack of discipline, but ultimately he will be held accountable because he's at the top of the chain of command. I remember very clearly, I was looking at him across the table, and you know you have a sense when something registers. A week later, he designated Angelina Tenney, his wife and Minister of Defense, as the high-level focal point. And once this conversation moved into the sanctions realm, it changed the tone, tenor, and inflection of our dialogue with him. Long story short, in South Sudan, on the strength of this kind of tactical use of briefings to the council, we were able to get the release of over 500 women and children who were held by SPLA commanders in one of the districts, and that followed a meeting between Riek Machar and SRSG Patton. So, in some cases where we have the contacts at the right level, where we have a level of information and intelligence, because I think that part of this is an information and intelligence challenge. We need to understand who they are, who are the commanders. We need to have that level of information in order to be able to make the right asks. In some cases, it will be possible to leverage this. In other cases, the parties will not care. And in fact, they may see it as a mark of achievement to be on a list of this sort. So I think the other thing I would say is that there is not a one-size-fits-all solution in this, that we will, that the tools will have to use them judiciously, and that we will have to do a careful analysis of the wide range of actors and parties committing these crimes and those who are listed, and recognize that some will care and some will not. And part of the information challenge is understanding who will care, what the pressure points are, and how we can get at them.
Thank you for that. And Natasha, maybe that dovetails well over to you to think again about your comment on making the designations process more alive and thinking about how not only to use sanctions as a punitive tool, but really thinking about how they can lead to changes in behavior. And of course, thinking about a survivor-centered approach, that is the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal here is to prevent and respond to CRSV, to ultimately address this crime. So if you have any further comment you want to make on that, and then there was also a question about the security of victims and some of the mechanisms that can be put in place there. So over to you, Natasha.
Thanks again, Jenna. I think the leverage piece is really multifaceted, and having an understanding of the impact that sanctions have outside of New York and outside of the committees, the number of members of the community that read those reports, and okay, there are public and confidential sections, but the confidential is always leaked, is enormous. I after the release of a report, I would genuinely have hundreds of WhatsApp messages from people across Somalia coming to me. So I think in terms of that information getting out there, don't underestimate it. And that leverage, I think the example of South Sudan was hugely powerful. But I'll give a second degree effect, if you like, in that working in Somalia, trying to get the attention of people who are managing active conflict, drought after flood, in really fragile situations with weak institutions. Just getting people's attention is a major achievement. And having conversations about the lack of progress by private sector institutions in terms of banks and telcos in putting in place protections that those institutions aren't being exploited makes the private sector very uncomfortable. The impact of their ability to trade internationally disappears if they're sanctioned. That was the mechanism to be able to convene the entire government, most of the major private sector or traditional leaders within Mogadishu, to have a conversation really broadly about what needed to be prioritized. So we can be talking about know your customer legislation, and that can be the trigger to actually having conversations. Where else are we exposed? What else is the international community looking at? What else do we really need to act on? And I think that part, that sort of slightly more indirect part, is something, again, not to underestimate. And if we have panels who are working the way they should, so much of that information on who is going to react under what reason is what we should be able to provide to our broader community. And that might partly be in informal reports, but it would absolutely be in face-to-face exchanges. So that's where I keep saying we are not a political actor, or I don't think panels have a role as a political actor, but informing those political decisions and knowledge, it's hugely valuable. So I'll just leave it on that piece.
Thanks for that. And I want to bring in also a couple of questions we've received online, because I think they go well with some of the conversation. There was one question again about levels of psychosocial support and measures of protection that the international community can give to victims and social workers. And again, I think the point was well taken from our first guest who spoke, that when we mentioned Survivor Center today, we were talking about sort of the immediate context of investigations. But of course, as we were trying to allude to, it's much bigger than that. And when we think about the ongoing levels of support that need to be provided, what does that look like, and how can we ensure that it's not only about sanctions, but also couching those within a broader response? So maybe for Pauline and Francesca to speak a bit on that, and Francesca, maybe for you as well on the member state side, there was a question on, what happens when violators are part of the governing system of a state, and how can member states place the proper pressure on those and a way forward, maybe when civil society doesn't have strong institutions to try and hold them accountable. So I'll start with Pauline and then over to you, Francesca.
Yeah, also I want to thank for that question about the more long-term support, and also it seems like it came up again also online. So it's important to see sanctions as a small piece in the puzzle, how we address conflict-related sexual violence. And this was the part of our panel here, but of course there is on so many levels support needed for survivors, on psychological support, be it economic empowerment initiatives, to really provide justice support, to provide a holistic support that survivors, that we owe survivors. And indeed the UN, we as UN agencies such as UN Women, we have offices in many conflict-affected countries where we implement programs that address some of these issues. I just came back this weekend from a mission to DRC, where we were actually where I was working with our country office to strengthen UN Women's response and work on conflict-related sexual violence, especially also in the context of the withdrawal of the UN peacekeeping mission MONUSCO there. So that is something that the UN is doing on the ground, but of course there are always limited resources, especially for work on conflict-related sexual violence and also on gender equality as a whole. It is not always easy to mobilize resources, but the tools and the work is being done, but of course much more is needed. One point also, just quickly to mention the importance of reparations as well, where UN Women is also engaged in advocacy and support around that. I would like to quickly respond to also the question on the tools of the Security Council. So yeah, we've discussed about sanctions, but there is tools are like the mandating of peacekeeping operations, and to ensure that these peacekeeping operations have, or peace operations more broadly, also special political missions, that these have a strong mandate on conflict-related sexual violence, that there are women protection advisors in these missions that are specifically mandated to support the government in efforts to prevent and respond to conflict-related sexual violence, and then also, of course, ensure that these positions are resourced. So yeah, that is an important tool of the Security Council. And then I've mentioned already the issue of funding. All Security Council members who receive this information, many of them also are donors to support work that is done outside of the Security Council. This more holistic response that I've been mentioning. Where hopefully also that information that we get from these reports helps to shed the light on these gaps and helps to have a stronger prioritization of conflict-related sexual violence, also in terms of funding.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your questions. Indeed, I think, a sticky point here is how the engagement should be with states when they are involved, when they are named as perpetrators. I think here we need to recognize the fact that there needs to be a narrative shift as well in how we engage with states. Typically also, as you were referring to, peacekeeping missions themselves, UN peace support operations, apart from having the deployment of women protection advisors and also child protection advisors, because we also have to recognize the fact that often children, minors, are also victims and survivors of CRCV. Typically, the mission in place would also support the state in question when it comes to legislation and adopting frameworks. For example, in the case of South Sudan, there's also the action plan for armed forces in addressing CRCV, which of course had a time-bound element, which now they are also working on having that renewed. So also by having this narrative shift and also enabling and assisting the government, typically in a transition setting. So here we are also discussing a government which is still in transition, and therefore this would enable this narrative shift within the government. That is also very helpful. Also, of course, when it comes to the council itself, for example, next week's meeting on CRCV is another moment where we're able to shed light on this important cases of CRCV, but also coming in with another novel approach to try and find that that key into discussing this with both survivors by getting civil society's voice as well. And the council is also very important. Also, as currently president of the council, we very much empower the voice of civil society, and they're able to be engaged in the room, in the chamber with us. And therefore, by enabling them and giving them that space is something which is worth knowing. And they often come with very powerful testimonies, so we should not underestimate them. And also maybe to respond to the question on the ICC, given that, of course, it's a complementary tool to the Security Council. Indeed, there have been cases, and there are cases, one of them in particular, because it's also a file that I handle presently as the expert on Africa, Sudan. Back in 2005, the Security Council had made a referral to the ICC, whereby they recognized as a council that Sudan, the case of Sudan, is a threat to international peace and security. Since then, investigations have been ongoing, even in the context of current hostilities, because at the time this referral was made, the case was the case of genocide that was taking place in Darfur back in 2005. And regrettably, of course, now we're seeing a relapse, a very unfortunate relapse of genocide and other war crimes in the region. And therefore, the ICC themselves, including the prosecutor, has made it a point to also include the investigations that are presently taking place in the current hostilities. So I think, even within the ICC, there are cases that have been produced that are involving also state-related actors, as well as other militias and non-state armed groups, which are typically involved in being listed. But really and truly, I think as a UN, as a Security Council, when it comes to the lowest hanging fruit, there are many ways. The peace support operations that we have so far, that we still have, have strong women protection and child protection mandates. One of them, of course, is MONUSCO in the DRC. There's also MINUSCA in Central African Republic, and of course, UNMISS in South Sudan. And I think by, with every renewal that comes, by supporting and of course strengthening as much as possible within resources, that could also help the peace operation on the ground to complement all these other tools that are taking place within the Council and more broadly. Yeah, that's really from my side. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And maybe just to emphasize again that part of this holistic approach that we're talking about is not only the survivor-centered and the psychosocial support, but again, thinking about what type of justice and accountability mechanisms need to be put in place. And again, re-emphasizing that sanctions are not a substitute for accountability through justice mechanisms. And we need to be moving all of these processes forward in tandem. Natasha, did I see that you were hoping to come back in on one of the online questions?
Sorry, just to really briefly clarify that it's not only the member state who is responsible for providing information to the 1267 regime. It is all member states. So all member states that have a presence in that country, who have intelligence assets, who have other ways of gathering information, can provide information on a specific state. And it is only 1267 that works directly with member states' intelligence services. So I don't think I explained that very well. Sorry.
Thank you so much. So I think we're just about at wrap-up time. Maybe before we close, Francesca, as you're preparing next week for the annual debate, any sort of key takeaways you want us to think about as we're talking more about a holistic approach to CRSV and kind of leading up to the debate next Tuesday?
Thank you so much for giving me that opportunity. Indeed, we very much look forward to our debate next week. So yes, I think by shedding light on CRSV, but also shedding light on the various facets of CRSV, including in this case, disarmament and demilitarization, oftentimes in conflict settings, SGBV is perpetuated and is exacerbated when there are evident and rampant flow of arms. So also by addressing other causal factors in CRCV, we are also able to address this, this phenomenon really. So yeah, we're also looking into potentially some insights on even how targeted arms embargoes within the existing sanctions regimes that we have, especially in those where they already have an arms embargo in place. How can these two be reconciled to ensure that an approach is as holistic as possible to mitigate both, the arms flows, but also those that perpetuate CRZV and those that perpetuate them. Exactly. So yeah, looking forward to our discussions next week. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I want to thank all of our panelists for being here today. And again, a huge thank you to Denmark and to you, Ambassador, for your time today. We encourage you to check out the report report. On the two-pager that's on your seat, there's a QR code that will link you to the report. We do have some hard copies out in the lobby. We also urge all of you to tune in to the open debate next Tuesday and to keep your eyes open for the annual report of the Secretary General that will be coming out very shortly. Thanks again to everyone for being here in person and online, and wishing everyone a wonderful day.